Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Time and Place, the gospel conversation show where we discuss faith on the fringes and do our best to bring God's word to God's world. My name is Solomon. This is Julian.
Yo.
And today we're going to be talking about God and comics. But first, Julian, what the heck is going on in the world today?
Competing worldviews have reached a whole new level. Everybody's favorite poster boy for free speech bought Twitter. So Elon owns it now.
Is that go through already?
It's through. It's set.
I thought something could still happen.
No, apparently there's almost nothing that could prevent it at this point. Like, it's good to go.
Wow.
So in response, the government freaks out, starts calling for social media regulation.
Yeah.
And is establishing their own department under the Department of Homeland Defense, a separate department to oversee the spread of disinformation. So our very own Ministry of Truth.
Yeah, our Orwellian Ministry of Truth.
It's here and it's real.
How I really want to see. Has there been anything, any interviews or any podcasts or anything where somebody asks a leftist or someone who's for all these things, what do you think about 1984? You know what I mean?
Well,
are they aware this book exists?
Yeah, but in their mind,
in
their mind, they're preventing it because in 1984 they were fascists. So they're fighting fascism.
What do they think fascism is, though?
Whatever is inconvenient for them at the moment. Whoever their opponent is, that's what fascism is.
They've left it, though. They've left the left.
Yes.
I think that's what it is they think, well, anything right-wing is fascist.
Yes.
And they're Republicans.
And as long as we're not right-wing,
so
we can't be fascist.
Yeah. And that's what's insane is that, hang on, look, like... is it really the thing of like we're Christians but we don't look like Christians at all, and it's like, well, you can't call yourself a Christian then. Is it the same people who are like, well, we don't have to read our Bible, we don't have to pray, we don't have to go to church, we don't have to do anything, but we're still Christians? That's a good comparison,
because it basically is
like,
that.
Well, maybe you're not, it's like, well, I mean, we were members of it's like, yeah, but what do you do? How in the world are you a Christian? If you're for anti-Christian things.
That's why, like, calling them liberals doesn't make sense, because there's nothing liberal about it. It's completely the opposite. Leftist, I don't even know if leftist doesn't even make sense anymore.
It's crazy, dude. Like, I mean, it really is nuts. This Ministry of Truth is basically what Twitter was, but for the government.
Right, government.
They just want fact-checking. They want to be the fact checkers.
Yes.
And everything.
They want to tell you what's true.
The only difference is Twitter doesn't have guns in jails.
Right, yes. And that's going to be interesting. Like, what exactly is the consequence for disinformation?
Yeah, being kicked off Twitter or getting kicked out of the country. Getting kicked out of your home, getting put in prison,
this woman, too, is in charge of it. I forget her name, but she's a whack.
Nina something.
She wrote an article and a book during the...
Did you see her singing?
Yes. The Mary Poppins, or the Sound of Music song with the
Mary Poppins.
Mary Poppins with misinformation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Holy crap!
And she's in charge of the government now.
This chick is unhinged.
You were in theater. Like, would you let a theater kid run part of the government?
Theater kids all are in charge of the Ministry of Truth.
Yeah.
I saw that video. I was like, this is so insane.
But that makes sense. I mean, the president of Ukraine was a TV star and a comedian. Over there,
the court jesters.
Yes, everything's
in charge.
Because everything left is performative, right? It's performative opposition. It's performative virtue. So why wouldn't you have a theater person in charge? It's all optics.
It makes sense, and it makes sense that the left, that Hollywood leans left because it's an imaginary world that they're living in, and so they'll create TV shows and movies where certain sort of relationships work out. Or certain sort of scenarios, where people are satisfied being lost, when in reality they're really not.
Yes,
you know what I mean. That. And it is the romanticization of that being lost, and there's no answers.
Yes,
and we're all just kind of
we're all trying to find our way,
drifting through the cosmos.
Right.
And so they say that, and they put it in movies and songs, music, in TV shows. But in reality, they're miserable. Yeah. They're all addicted to painkillers.
Right.
But they don't show that part in the movie.
No.
You know what I mean?
Well, and when they do, they even romance that.
Again,
the drug addiction is romantic. And train spotting and...
Well, it's like, what it is? It's the tortured genius.
Yes.
It's the Rick from Rick and Morty. It's the I just have figured it all out, and it's all meaningless.
And it's all fake.
And everyone else is just too dumb.
Yes.
If you're ever happy and satisfied or content in any way,
you're an idiot.
You haven't been enlightened.
Right. Cynicism is intelligence.
Once you've been enlightened, you'll be miserable.
Yes. That's exactly
awesome.
What it is.
What a message. What a great thing to have.
Yeah.
And then they'll have to like tie it up with something of like, well, there's family.
Maybe he's not. Yeah. Maybe he's not right. There is something.
But for today,
he's a genius, but he's missing this thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's all stupid.
So it makes sense that the theater kid in that, and I say all that to say it makes sense that a theater kid or performative, actor and weirdo is part of the Ministry of Truth.
I saw a post on TikTok where somebody made a comment like, some guy was talking to me about his 4th kid, and he was going on about it, and he was like, "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to brag," but I was thinking to myself like, "No, your life sounds way worse than mine. It's not a problem." And I was like, "How? How does that guy's life worse than yours? What are you doing?" Man,
I was listening to our last episode talking about like the survival of the fittest and natural selection and stuff, and they're so contradictory because they claim that's how the world works.
Yes,
and while doing it, while literally killing off their offspring.
Yeah,
and we're having kids, and so it's like, don't you see where this is going?
That's why they have to have yours.
That's why they educate.
Yeah, because they can't. They don't have their own. Yeah.
Man, so better leave a legacy, or someone else is going to snatch your kids and do it for you.
Man. So, man, speaking of cynicism, getting into our topic today: Christianity and comics. Comics with an X and comics with a C, because it covers both. So,
yeah,
I would say I wouldn't say right under religion. Comic books is probably the biggest thing in my life that influenced me as a kid growing up. Like the two most important things to me were there was like church, faith, and the comic book store.
Yeah, I mean, well, we worked at a comic book store.
Yeah,
sort of met at a comic book store and worked together at a comic book store. We met before that, and like
at church.
Met at church, and then started working at a comic book store together, and that was fun. Yeah, I got really into comics just like from an academic sense. Like I wanted to like write comics, but I also did all my papers in college about comics and stuff. Like if I had a history paper or an art paper, I did an art paper about Crumb. And
nice.
My art appreciation class, we had to pick an artist. And so I picked Crumb, and there was a documentary I saw and stuff, and just about comic book art in general, and wrote a whole paper on it. And
is it comic book confidential, or was it a different one?
What?
The documentary that you saw about it?
No, it was a comic book confidential.
Yeah.
I mean, Art School Confidential?
No. That's the movie, which I've also seen. That's the Dan Clowes movie. No, but there's a book and a doc called
I haven't seen it.
Comic Book
Confidential. Just called Crumb, I think.
Okay. Yeah, there's a Crumb one too.
Yeah.
I know there's a one called Comic Book Confidential where Crumb is in it, but so is Frank Miller, and it's like everybody who was big in the 80s in comics was in it. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've always looked at that, and then in that too, I actually took an anthropology of superheroes class in college. And when we were working at Heroes, the professor came in during the summer, and he came in looking for comics for the class. And he told me that, and I was like, "Oh, well, I go to UTSA.
You have any spots?"
Yeah, and he's like, "Sign up." And he's like, "What?" He's like, "I'm actually looking for some like sort of cyborg comics and stuff." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So I got to help pick out the
curriculum
for the class, and sold it to the professor, and then I had like buy the comics at the school because they had them.
God, thank God it was you, and he didn't walk in and meet someone who gave him like a stack of Deadpool.
Well, I showed him. I tried to show him, and he used Ex Machina.
Okay.
For that's what I suggested to him, but then he had some other book that sucked. And then he had like Miss Marvel, the new one and stuff. He had like he had some crap in there for sure. And the class became like was not what I thought it was going to be. It was just basically anthropology with superheroes. Because he was an anthropology teacher,
right?
And it just became. I thought it was like we're going to study. I should have known. Like it's an anthropology class. Like it's not going to be studying.
It's going to be like the roots of superheroes and the history
as literature. That's what I was looking for. But the reason I was excited about that because in this book, Super Gods by Grant Morrison,
great book,
he talks about the 2D universe of comic books being a real existing place, like an actual place that's as real as anything we understand to be real.
Right.
And he was talking about how writers and artists come to comics and come to these characters, and readers come to these characters and to comics. He said we can either come as missionaries or anthropologists. As in, missionaries come and try to change their culture.
Yes.
And try to indoctrinate them and try to convert them away from their native ways to their way. And anthropologists come and just study, just observe and report and look and study. And he was saying that's how we should come to comics, is as anthropologists, not as missionaries. Don't try to make superhero like you. Don't make like Superman like you.
Right.
Don't try to make the comics like the real world. They're not. They're in their own world.
Right.
Just that's okay. Leave them there, and we can just observe and interact with them on their terms. So
that's fair.
It's very heady and very weird and like meta,
Yeah.
And so I was excited about this anthropology of superheroes,
and then it was not that.
It was totally busted. Yeah.
I like that concept though, because I feel like that's why comics have been kind of sucky lately. Is because people are approaching it as missionaries.
Oh yeah, they're woke missionaries.
Yes.
Trying to impose like, hey, Thor, you need to be a girl.
Yes, exactly. They've turned it into they're turning characters into themselves.
Yeah, gay and trans,
female, woke, minority. That's crazy to me. That's one thing about the woke stuff that I never understood was when they were like, you have to see characters that look like you, and I was like, why? Why is it only relatable if it's you? Like you can only relate to yourself. That's it. Because Spider-Man is not me, and I love Spider-Man. I've never had a problem like.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just strange to me.
Well, so I want to kind of jump into Super Gods, which honestly, I think we should start a podcast.
Going through that?
No.
Oh.
we should start a podcast where we talk about theology and comics and call it Super Gods.
That'd be pretty good.
That would be pretty cool.
You get on? You get Grant Morrison on?
Yes. Get comic creators on. Try and convert them. I like this one part. He says, I tend to believe that the reverse is true, that it's adults who have the most trouble separating fact from fiction. A child knows that real crabs on the beach do not sing or talk like the cartoon crabs in Little Mermaid. A child can accept all kinds of weird-looking creatures and bizarre occurrences in a story because the child understands that stories have different rules that allow for pretty much anything to happen. Adults, on the other hand, struggle desperately with fiction, demanding constantly that it conform to the rules of everyday life. Adults foolishly demand to know how Superman can possibly fly, or how Batman can possibly run a multi-billion-dollar business empire during the day and fight crime at night.
Right.
When the answer is obvious to the smallest child, because it's not real.
Yes.
And I like it, Grant Morrison's, this is Super Gods by Grant Morrison. Really great book. He's a comic writer, really crazy, weird guy, but really awesome book about comics and the world and just all kinds of different stuff. Really cool. But I love his approach to it because, people ask like, Batman who would win, Batman or Superman? He's like, Superman, of course. Like, come on.
Yeah.
Are you crazy? He has superpowers. And Batman doesn't. Like, that's it. Game over. He's like, what about this? What about that? Okay, whatever.
When you try to real world it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's real world.
There's one interview I saw where he was talking about that, where someone was badgering about how like the mechanics of Superman's flight, and he was like, "Oh, it's very simple. He flies because it's not real. That's why he can fly." Like, yeah, obviously.
Yeah. I don't know if it was him, but it was something. It was like, how do you kill a vampire? Someone asked. Like,
oh, it was Max Landis. Max Landis said it. I know. Yeah.
Right. How do you kill a vampire? Like, drive a stake through his heart. Garlic, or he's like. No, you can't kill vampires. Vampires aren't real.
Right.
There's no such thing. So there's no rules.
There's no rules. Right. Exactly.
You can do whatever you want. This next second part too, because there's a golden age of comics, which was like what 1939 to 50,
beginnings to the 60s, really.
56, something like that. So the golden age was over, but the world in which the heroes were dying was a world that needed them like never before. 50s America was a land of edginess and prowling paranoia, hovering as it did on the verge of thermonuclear annihilation. Alone at night in the midst of unprecedented luxury after a successfully won world war, Americans were more frightened than ever before. There was fear of the bomb, the communist, the homo, the Negro, the teenager, the id, the flying saucers, the existential void. There was the space race with its launch into the limitless unknown, and Kinsey's groundbreaking surveys into the sexual habits of Americans, opening and dripping treasure chest of a buttoned-up country's inner life, revealing a sleep sleep world of polychromatic polymorphous perversity acted out behind a camouflage of pipe-smoking patriarchs and Stepford wives. There were as many different kinds of fear as there were brands of gum.
Man,
does that wrap up the 50s?
Yeah, pretty much.
Of like this Beaver Cleaver picture,
the veneer
but then
of
constant
kids
hiding
anxiety,
under desks because the bomb was coming.
Bomb. That's the craziest thing to think about, is that they really were on the verge of annihilation every day.
Dude, it's crazy to think about. Like, oh my god, the bomb! We could go to nuclear war any second. Now it's about to end.
Yeah.
Do you think that? I think that. You think that had the most to do with premillennial eschatology, dispensational eschatology?
I could definitely see
end
that.
of the world.
Yeah,
and annihilation.
Like we can destroy ourselves at any moment.
Right now, it's ending.
Yeah.
The Revelation is talking about us, and I mean that had to, right? That had
to
heighten that. I mean, I've talked to people who we talk a lot about on the show about patriarchy and leaving a legacy, and our grandchildren worshiping the same God as we do, thinking about the future long term,
right?
And how what we're doing now sets that up in a spiritual way, laying that foundation for our children and grandchildren to be Christians and to just leave a legacy that way, like a biblical Christian legacy. And I remember talking to people, like this couple at our church who are like my parents' age, and we were talking about all this stuff, and she's like, we never talked about this. We never thought. She's like, it was the 80s, it was the 90s. Like, we thought Jesus was coming back any second. We didn't think about our kids as adults.
Man.
I was like, you didn't think about your kids as adults? Like, what would they do? And I think they really didn't. The party like it's 1999.
Yeah.
I asked my mom, I was like, what did y'all think about like the year 2000 was coming? She's like, it never crossed our minds once in high school, in the 70s and 80s in high school, that you're in a few years, you're going to see the millennium. What do you think about that? They didn't think about it at all.
Wow.
It's crazy how out of their mind it was of like, you're going to see 2023. You realize that, right?
Right.
People live, I mean, the
lifespan
is not 50 years old. You're probably going to be 60 or 70. Like, you're going to see, it's crazy that they don't even like think about that at all.
That is crazy, because I feel like now we think about the future so much.
Yeah.
Like, where is this technology going? Where is society going to be? What are we looking at in the future? I can't fathom that world where you don't even think. That's a conversation that my wife and I have a lot, is like, well, I wonder what they're going to be like when they're older. I wonder what they're going to be into when they're old. Like, I can't fathom just not thinking that. That's crazy.
Yeah. This one interesting part too. He talks about Grant Morrison's whole thing was he was afraid of the bomb, and so that's why he liked Superman,
right?
Because Superman like stopped nuclear
he was stronger
war
than the
and
bomb.
stuff, and he was like he could save us.
Yeah.
And so there's all of the atomic age stuff. He was really like freaked out by that. He says, in the Marvel U, radiation was a kind of pixie dust. Sprinkle it on a scientist, and voila, a superhero was born. Radiation was responsible for the origins of the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, the Hulk, X-Men, Daredevil, and several other early Marvel superheroes, transforming the isotopes of fear into fuel rods of wonder and possibility. Stan Lee stole back the annihilating radiation of the bomb, and for children like me, raised in its icy shadow, he peopled the glowing darkness with extraordinary heroes. So it's interesting how like this specter of doom of the bomb and radiation and everything, Stan Lee kind of turned and like, hey, man, what if gamma radiation didn't give you cancer?
Right.
What if it turned you into the Hulk? What if it made you more powerful? Like, I think that was a very revolutionary turn of like, hey, let's look at this in a good light. Radiation can help you. That's pretty interesting. Like, I don't know. I thought that was cool. And then he talks about Peter Parker and what you were kind of talking about, like relatable heroes and stuff. He says, spotty hormonal outsiders had a new hero in Peter. Clark Kent had his own apartment and a steady job, but Peter was a genuine loser. Peter revealed the truth behind the sugared lies of Barry Allen and Ray Palmer. The sugared lies of Barry Allen and Ray Palmer. No good-looking girl ever fancied a scientist. Peter effed up, got the flu, ran out of money and hope. Peter would sit hand-sewing his damaged Spider-Man costume in his tiny room at Aunt May's in Queens, while newspapers condemned his crime-fighting alter ego as a menace to society. That was interesting about like, that relatable hero.
Yeah.
That's why I like Spider-Man.
Right, yeah.
Because it's like, man, I've felt pretty down and out sometimes.
Right.
And, just to have that like hope.
That maybe it'll work out.
Yeah. Get that Peter
Spider-Man can get through it.
That Parker luck.
Oh, man. I remember that too when I was wrestling, when I had like blow out my gear. Like, yeah, I gotta be at home sewing this shut now.
You feel like Spider-Man.
Feel like Spider-Man sewing his suit up.
So Grant Morrison's whole thing is that he can dude, this thing's about to fall. He can visit the 2D universe as an anthropologist or as himself. I think it's still gonna. Dude, that's way loose. Anyway, and this is kind of where we can like tie it into what I think as far as how this spoke to me as a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of different universe and stuff is that God is the author of our universe,
right? And
we are the author of these
comic universes,
2D comic book universes,
right?
And that kind of put it into context for me as far as sovereignty and who we are,
right, in relation,
and who God is, and who's really in control here. And that really like kind of painted a picture. And I guess you could do the same with novels, and stuff. And I know C.S. Lewis did that a little bit with Shakespeare, as far as like, you know, what if the author came into the story, you know, from because the like I think he talked about like Hamlet, you know, he can't find Shakespeare, but Shakespeare could find him, you know, put himself into the story. And that's what Grant Morrison actually like literally did.
Right.
He takes that to like a whole new level. Well, he says, let me see. He talks about in the real world, superheroes looked like drawings or special effects, as artist David Mazzucchelli would one day state so succinctly, quote, once a depiction veers toward realism, each new detail releases a torrent of questions that exposes the absurdity at the heart of the genre. The more, quote, realistic superheroes become, the less believable they are. It's a delicate balance, but this much I know. Superheroes are real when they're drawn in ink. So my experiment on Animal Man, which is a DC comic he wrote, were described as by critics as metafiction or fiction about fiction. And perhaps that was an easy way in for some readers, but I felt that I was onto something more concrete and less rooted in abstraction or theory. The fictional universe I was interacting with was as real as our own. As I began to think of the DC universe as a place, it occurred to me that there were two ways to approach it: as a missionary or as an anthropologist. So that's what he's talking about. He says, in Animal Man, I created, with the help of my artistic collaborator, Chaz Truog, a paper version of myself that could be integrated with the 2D DC universe. I sent my avatar onto the page surface to meet the Animal Man character and confirm suspicions he had been having that his life story was being written by some demiurgic Gnostic overlord. I explained to my character how the people who wrote his life needed drama and shock and violence to make this story interesting. The implication was that our own lives might also be written to entertain or instruct an audience in a perpendicular direction we could never point to, interacting with us in ways we could scarcely understand, but that could be divined in the relationship of the comic world to the world of the creator and audience. Man, that is what's really interesting, like the creator and the audience, and I think God is both. You know,
well, it's also, I mean, that's very Pauline when Paul talks about the things that happened in Exodus and all through the Torah, and he's like, these things happened to them, but they were written down for our benefit, so that we would understand these principles.
Right. So, and they themselves and us being characters in this story, this, and I think that's how we need to look at reality. Is this is God's story, and we are in it. And I think to a lot of people that's depressing, and they don't like that. They don't like having so little autonomy,
right?
You know, but it's like I think the sooner you accept that, the more things make sense.
Well, and in Animal Man, that's how Buddy reacts too when he finds out it's a story. He's like, "This is my life. This isn't a story. You killed my wife. You killed my kids."
Yeah, it's like, well. They weren't yours. I mean, they weren't.
They weren't real, but
yeah. Yeah. It says in this other part, it says there were real superheroes. Of course, they did exist. They lived in paper universes suspended in pulp continuum, where they never aged or died unless it was to be reborn, better than ever, with a new costume. Real superheroes lived on the surface of the second dimension. The real lives of real superheroes could be contained in two hands. They were so real they had lives that were longer than any human life. They were more real than I was. They say most human names and biographies are forgotten after 4 generations, but even the most obscure Golden Age superhero is likely to have a life and a renown that will last as long as trademarks are revived.
Wow. Yeah, that's true. Like Bob Kane is dead and Batman isn't.
Yeah.
That's
well, and he mentions too about like facts and truth and how you can be wrong about Batman. You know what I mean? So like, oh, Batman, and then Batman flew and did this. Like, wait a second,
right? Batman doesn't fly.
Hang on, you're incorrect. It's like, what do you mean
about this fake thing?
Yeah. Well, and then he puts it like in the past and stuff, as far as like, well, Abraham Lincoln and Julius Caesar, like these are characters, you know, and then like Sherlock Holmes and stuff. He's like, are these? When does there's a photograph of Julius Caesar or Sherlock Holmes, you know? And so what are we talking about here when we talk about all we know is how they're written on paper and stuff. So it's kind of like that blending of fact and fiction, you know.
That's interesting because I think we think about Bible characters in that way too.
Right.
Like we think of them as like characters and not real people.
Yeah. And they've been mythologized.
Yes.
And there's a whole process of that, of, you know, the thing, stories becoming legend.
Yes.
And stuff. But it's weird to think like, okay, the furthest back you can go is Adam and Eve, right? And I'm going to get on my creation soapbox for a second. I mean, this has been on my mind a lot lately.
Okay.
Because I just finished On the Origin of Species by Darwin. And just some other books I'm planning on reading. I've just been doing a lot of research on this. And Adam and Eve, they've in the garden, that more than probably any other story gets mythologized.
Yes.
Right. And put into legend and song and poetry or whatever.
Right.
And we need to be very careful when we do that. I understand the genre argument. I understand, we need to read the Bible as it is, which is, in song, it's in poetry. Okay. I agree. But there can be songs and poetry about real things that happen about real people. And I would classify it more as that biographical legend or myth, but it's the true myth.
Yes.
That makes all other myth meaningful or anything else. Because, you think back like, okay, Julius Caesar, Abraham Lincoln, something, we don't have anybody alive that knew them.
Right. Or
even knew their grandkids.
Right.
Or even knew, you know what I mean? So then it kind of gets drifted off into like, well, it's the past, it's history, did it exist? Did things really happen that way? And there's a bunch of quotes from different people like, well, it's doubtful they really said that, who knows, things become legend.
Right.
And stuff like that. So, the issue is we have artifacts of Julius Caesar.
Yes.
We have art, right? We find ruins of ancient civilization that there's writings about him that are old, that are from that time that we have. Marcus Aurelius, we have meditations, we have these things that they wrote down and were passed on. And I think in many ways the Bible is that, as far as the characters and stuff in the Bible, but also what remnant or artifact or little piece of history, tangible piece of history, that do we have from the garden and Adam and Eve in the beginning of creation that we still have today? It's death.
Right. Because
Adam and Eve is a story of how death enters the world. And that's not a poetic death.
It's an actual death.
That's actual death and pain and sin and misery and suffering. If those exist, Adam and Eve exist. Not only that, death, there can't be this theistic evolution because there can't be millions of years of death before the fall.
Yes.
So that's the story, is like, there was all this evolution, and then the lower hominids, and then the Neanderthals, and then there was some spark of divination, spark of spirit, of the spirit of consciousness into some animal. And that was really maybe how God entered into this creation. But the problem is that that's Adam and Eve, and then they fall. So then there's sin and death into the world. But death would have had to exist for millions of years.
Yes.
Through the process. Evolution is the process of death. And so you can't have nature red in tooth and claw for millions of years before the fall. You just can't. That's that. And death is the enemy of Christ. And that's what he came to defeat. So if death is not an enemy of Christ and just something that he can look down on and say, this is good, before the fall, then what did Jesus come for?
What does any of it mean?
Yeah,
nothing.
How can you even call yourself a Christian if you start meddling with the very reason that Jesus came to earth? And so, which is to conquer death. And so, I mean, it just doesn't line up theologically or doctrinally in a big way, in a
huge way.
John 3:16 way.
Right. You know everything hinges on Genesis. 1 through 3.
Yeah.
Without that, like the Gospels don't make sense. Nothing Paul writes makes sense.
Adam with no first Adam.
Right. Exactly.
There's no reason the second Adam is because the first Adam. Okay, first Adam can't be a song if the second Adam, is real.
Right.
But the problem is, I think this is a really big blind spot and really big issue of how people see Jesus and their own sin is as metaphorical. Well, it's not really, we start doing that with our own sin even today. Same way we do with the garden. Well, that's just kind of what they thought, and that's the best way they could explain origins. Right. They didn't know, they didn't have science, they didn't have all these things we have today. But people start doing that with our own sin. It's like, well, are they psychotic? Well, they're the product of their environment. They're not really sinning. They're just, lashing out. It's a product. It's how they were raised. We psychologize and scientism these things away. Just today, as we do with our own sin, as we do with Adam's sin at the very beginning. So if we do that with the garden, why shouldn't we do that with the gospel today? If we reject the garden, why do we reject, Christ's empty tomb? So I think they're more connected than we think. I think in a really big, detrimental way.
I think about that with the atonement a lot. When I was watching a video where a guy was talking about atonement theory and the various theories, and obviously we subscribe to penal substitutionary atonement, right? Like Christ died to satisfy the wrath of God, which I think is scripturally borne out. I don't understand how you could read the scripture and come to any other conclusion other than that. When he's a propitiation offered for sin, like who is he offered to and who is he satisfying?
On that cross that Jesus died, the wrath of God
was satisfied. Right, exactly.
They want to change that line.
Yes, they do. Right? He came to free us.
The love of God was sad.
I mean, Isaiah 53. He pleased God. It pleased God to crush him. Like, where else can you go with that?
Yeah.
But I think we like to mythologize all of that, and I don't know. I mean, I guess I do know because it gives us license to do whatever we want. And that's why.
Yeah,
that bothers me. I like the idea of it being mythical but true too. I've kind of in my own mind refer to it, the Bible, that is, as the meta myth, because it is mythic, but it's the myth that everything exists inside of.
Right.
So it's the myth that encompasses reality. So it's the meta myth. It's the myth that all other myths exist inside of.
Right. And I think people are very dissatisfied to feel like our lives and the whole history of humanity and everything is a story.
Right.
But we know the ending of the story.
Right. And it's good.
Right. So, take comfort in that, as far as having our eyes open. And it really is that like thing of Buddy Baker seeing Grant Morrison of like, who are you? Like what? You're, and that's how Christ came into the story. Like he stepped down.
I like it too because I pulled up this panel right here where Morrison actually meets Buddy, and they have this exchange where he says, Buddy says to him, "I feel things, I care about things. You can't take that away from me." And I think that's how a lot of people do look at the sovereignty of God. Like, I made choices, I have freedom. You can't take that away from me.
Yeah,
and it's like, well, yeah, you thought you did.
Yeah, well, that's interesting with this. Like, there's this really good book called "Who Needs a Superhero" by H. Michael Brewer. I found this at half price, random, and just kind of started looking through it. It says finding virtue, vice, and what's holy in the comics. So this is like exactly our book. This is he goes through different characters and he draws different parallels between them. Like Spider-Man, great power comes great responsibility, showing how if we've been enlightened and shown the gospel in the saving power of Jesus Christ, we have a responsibility.
To whom much is given, much is required.
Right. I mean, so there's a lot of parallels, even to like Siegel and Schuster creating a god-like superhero called Kal-El.
Right. Yes.
With that L being the Hebrew for God.
Right, for God.
Right? And that's like the kind of classic. We don't even know if they meant to do that or if it was just kind of.
Well, it just came out of their worldview, right? Yeah. Like their background.
Like, let's just have it be L. Like, okay. But with Batman specifically, this book talks about Batman as like trying to save himself. and being on a mission that he like bears this weight of guilt and responsibility and stuff, and how we can't. That's not okay. We shouldn't.
Right.
It says Batman passes through the world wrapped in mourning colors and guilt. His hard work and good deeds always fall short. He tries so fervently, but he never measures up in his own eyes. A lifetime of self-sacrifice and joyless virtue cannot atone for the guilt he carries. Even his muscled shoulders can scarcely bear that load. Batman has much in common with the rich young man who asked Jesus how to find salvation in Matthew 19. Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life? The man asked. Jesus first reminded the young man that only God is good, and we human beings should keep our goodness in proper perspective. Then Jesus pointed the seeker to the laws of Moses. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother. Also you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Had the young man been older and wiser, Jesus' reply might have humbled him. After all, true law keeping requires obedience that's inward as well as outward, and can anyone honestly claim to have never wished harm to another, or harbored a lustful thought, or stretched the truth? But the young man was brash. I have kept all these, he said. What do I still lack? So that is Batman. Of like, who's done more good than Batman?
Right.
You know? not a superhero. I mean, in our own human, capacity.
We don't fight crime every night.
Right. But he bears this like guilt that he can't forgive himself.
Batman is Catholic.
Which is actually yes, that's a lot of
he's making penance.
Of Christianity is penance, and I've got to fight and suffer, and and but it's like that is not the Christian way.
Right.
It is the Catholic way. But not the Christian way, the biblical Christian way. There's no surrender there,
right?
And he can't forgive himself, which is actually a sin, because if we can't say like, there's a lot of people say, I know God forgives me, but I can't forgive myself. Okay, you're putting your standard above God,
right?
Who do you think you are to do that? It's so arrogant and prideful to say. Sounds like humility, but it's not. It's actually it's a big sin. You put your standard of forgiveness above God's, and that's ridiculous. So that was Batman's big one. Oh, he talks about let me see. Yeah, there's one other thing about Batman. He says the truth is Batman's sole hope for peace and redemption lies precisely in surrendering himself to forgiveness. Only when Batman gives up the quest for personal perfection will he be able to welcome the grace that cannot be earned. Although Batman is as good as any human being can be, he will never be good enough. Neither hard work nor good works can free Bruce Wayne from the guilt and despair that torment him. No matter how fiercely he tries, Batman can never save himself. No one can. With human beings, this is impossible. There was another one where he talks about Wonder Woman and truth, and that was pretty interesting. But he talks about Daredevil and discernment. So kind of seeing, because he can hear everything. Right. And so he has to filter out the noise and stuff. Says, hang on. He says, immersing ourselves in the Bible is the surest way to understand who God is. As we read of God's mighty acts and ponder God's messages delivered through prophets and letter writers, we develop a working knowledge of the nature and character of God. So he's talking about how we grow discernment and wisdom, and it's by immersing ourselves in prayer and in the Bible, and so we know the true one. And he has this story, because the more you study Scripture and the more you study God, the more you can the more you can spot a counterfeit. Right. And so he has this story about a counterfeit comic. He says, ever so often a counterfeit comic book comes along and a few unwary people pay an exorbitant price for a worthless book. Oof. For instance, phony copies of Eerie #1 made the rounds a few years ago, and they sold quite well until the word got around. When DC reprinted the extremely rare Action #1, the company made the reprint an oversized edition and added an outer cover identifying the book as a facsimile. Even with these precautions, some unscrupulous sellers removed the extra cover and sold them in mutilated reprint for huge sums of money. The unfortunates who buy these bogus books usually don't know much about comics to start with. They will fall for a fake because they never seen the real thing. At a convention, I saw a well-meaning fan approach Dave Sim, the creator of Cerebus the Aardvark, with a bootleg copy of the first issue. Since I own the original, I recognized the fake, but the proud owner didn't. He presented the book to Dave Sim and asked him to sign it. Sim matter-of-factly opened the book and signed the name of fantasy artist Frank Frazetta at the bottom of the first page. The bewildered fan looked at the signature and sputtered, "But you aren't Frank Frazetta. And that's not Cerebus number 1," Sim said. He needed to point out the telltale signs the book was a fake. So we learned that you got to be careful with what comics you buy, and that Dave Sim's kind of a dick.
I mean, I knew that, but
yeah. So it's talk about like being, studying the real thing so you can spot the counterfeits, basically.
This is kind of I want to tell an anecdote from the time we worked at the comic book store, because putting it into biblical perspective, it reminds me of the story of Jacob and Esau. How Esau was willing to sell his birthright for a bowl of soup. I don't know if you remember this. I don't know how you could forget it. But we used to get from time to time guys that would come in with Tupperware bins full of comic books. Like, oh, I've got this collection. It's a bunch of stuff. It's all number ones. And it was all early 90s image crap that you couldn't sell. There was a million copies. We can't do anything with it. Yeah. So every time it was like, we don't need it. We can't take it. One time this guy came in, and I know for sure Rick was there. I think you were there too. This guy comes in and he says, I got this bin of books. I don't know. My uncle died. I don't really know anything about comics, but I don't want it anymore. So can I sell this? And we're like, all right, well, let's crack it open. So you crack it open. We're looking inside, and immediately first Punisher. Like, okay. And we're going through it, and there's more Death of Elektra, first Wolverine. All of this stuff sitting in there.
Like $300, $500.
Yeah, books. And trying to keep a straight face, like not trying to poker face him. And he's like, yeah, I don't really know anything about him. I was hoping like $300. Absolutely, you can have $300 for all of this.
You shafted him, you didn't tell him?
I mean, I didn't make the deal. But you know who did, and you know who shafted him.
Yeah, I did that one time on accident. This older lady came in. This was at the other comic store.
Okay.
I was GM. And she comes in, and she's like, I have all these comics. My son left them or something, and he doesn't want them. I need to get rid of them. They've been in my garage. And I'm like, and there was like 3 long boxes. I'm like, and it was busy. It was busy. It was like a Saturday. I was like, right. I don't have time. Yeah, I was like, I can take them and look through. I was like, $50 for all of them, just without sight unseen.
Right.
I'm taking the risk. I haven't looked what's in there. It's all
You're getting $50.
Well, I kind of looked through the first few, and it's all 90s stuff.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, it's general. Like, okay, 90s sucked, and they are worthless usually. And I gave her $50 for like 3 long boxes, and she's like, okay, thanks, whatever. And then it's like the next day or like later that week, we start going through them. See like first Harley Quinn in comics, first Deadpool.
Oh my god,
first Hellboy. Like a lot. I was like,
that's even more rare. The first Hellboy.
Like, oh no. But with every purchase, we get their info, and so I called her and tried to do the right thing. I was like, I felt so bad. I was like, dang it. I called and I was like, hey, we looked through these and there's some more expensive books. And she was like, well, I was like, so you could probably get more for these online,
right?
Or something. And she's like, I don't know how to do that. And I'm like, well, I don't know. And she's like, that's fine.
Oh.
And I was like, I'm sorry.
So the lesson is, if your family leaves you anything,
and she was like from out of town, so she was like,
she wasn't coming back.
She couldn't come back in town. Or something. I was like, I give you more money. I was like, come in, Yeah. So I felt bad about that, but
that's so good. Man,
it worked out for us.
Yeah, right. It always does.
There's one more section from this book I want to read. I thought it was pretty interesting. It talks about Captain America's shield, and of course, classic,
right.
Shield, and God protects us, God watches over us, and everything. But then he talked about Wolverine. And he's talking about different forms of protection and how we say God watches over us, with God all these things, but bad things happen. Like right. I don't see how Paul was really protected, in a lot of ways. He's had a pretty miserable life, and a lot of Christians face a lot of bad, tragic things.
Right.
And he said, this after all is Wolverine's chief heroic quality, the ability to keep on keeping on. He feels pain just as keenly as anyone else, but he knows he can survive the pain and come to the other side. When we think about God's protection, we need to remember both Wolverine and Captain America. Sometimes God's protection is an unbreakable shield, deflecting the dangers that would destroy us. At other times, God's protection is the sustaining inward strength that sees us through and heals us afterward. Paul had this inner power in mind when he wrote, "Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. 2 Corinthians 4:16. God always knows what we need, and God unfailingly provides for both our protection and growth. So that's interesting. Like sometimes it is a shield,
right?
And sometimes the shield is the Holy Spirit inside you, sustaining you and carrying you through, like Wolverine's adamantium skeleton, being able to regenerate,
right?
And just to bounce back and not be completely obliterated even by a bomb or something.
Right. And as you get older, you start to see that in your life play out.
Yeah.
Like you really do. That's interesting. That's a really interesting way to look at that.
That was pretty cool.
What's the name of that one again? If anybody wants to find that.
Yeah. Who Needs a Superhero? By H. Michael Brewer.
H. Michael Brewer, if you're out there.
You need to get him on the pod, dude.
Come talk, dude. We'll talk comics and theology forever.
Come on, Super Gods.
We'll get him and Grant Morrison on the same panel.
Dude, they've mentioned Grant Morrison on Rogan, and that would be the best interview ever.
Would be the most mushroomed out.
Grant Morrison on Joe Rogan would be insane.
Oh my god!
Rogan wanted to be a comic artist when he was little. I guess.
Didn't everybody?
Not me.
Oh man, I did.
I want to be a comic writer or something.
Yeah. Well, you want to become a writer when you find out you can't draw.
Mm-hmm.
That's what.
That was me.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I still want to work in comics.
I got good ideas, but like can't draw them out.
Man,
yeah.
That's deep, man. I mean, I feel like there's a wellspring to draw from, especially if we consider comic books in America are largely created by Jewish immigrants or the sons of Jewish immigrants who had a theistic worldview and background at the very least. There's a lot of stuff in there that
I didn't know that like actual Nazis came to the studio where Kirby was working and stuff, and he like
like American New York Nazis,
he like knocked him out, beat him up. It's amazing.
Yeah, well, Jack Kirby was Ben Grimm, like in real life. That was just smaller. That was him.
Yeah,
man. Yeah, that's good stuff. We've got some examples, and we don't have time to go through them, but I'm thinking through the week we'll probably do some videos on these because there's a long history of the book of Genesis illustrated by R. Crumb, which is bizarre. I'll never get over that. That's so weird. The guy who did Fritz the Cat is also illustrating Genesis. Punk Rock Jesus. This book is terrible. It's not good at all. I'm sorry, Sean Murphy. I love you as an artist, but this writing is trash.
Yeah,
just utter trash.
It's the typical like cynical view of church and religion and stuff, and it's Jesus as a they claim to have found remnants and DNA of Jesus and clone him,
right?
And he's this like punk rock kid who hates everything, and
and he wrote. I was reading because this is the deluxe edition. His little intro. He's like, I came up with this idea in 2006 after I left the faith. He was a Catholic, and he was like, and when it started off, it was just to piss off fundamentalists. I was like, yeah, I can tell by reading it. This isn't a good story. This is just you thinking you're edgy or whatever.
Yeah, but you know what? That speaks to the idea of Jesus as a rebel, but that's actually not true because Jesus is reclaiming and redeeming.
He was a reformer.
Back to right. It's not trying to like upend.
No.
Oh, I hate everything. We need to think differently. He's like, no. You guys are the rebels. You Pharisees are the rebels.
Yes.
You are not following the law. You are not being consistent. You're hypocrites, and he's the only consistent one.
Yes.
And so he's not the rebellious.
No, he was a fundamentalist.
Right.
He was a fundamentalist reformer.
Calling people to repent of their rebellious ways and draw them back to
hyper-exclusive
God's original intent. Yeah.
Jesus was all the things that people complain about religion. He was a fundamentalist. He was a biblical literalist. He was a hyper-exclusatory. He made all kinds of statements like that.
Yeah, but people like to put it in this like, well, Jesus was a rebel.
Right. He was a hippie. He was for the people.
He was against the power and against the man. And it's like
he was friends with prostitutes and tax collectors. Like yes, after he called them out for being prostitutes and tax collectors.
Yeah. Yeah, is this like rebellious frame that they want to put Jesus in? Right. It's like, no, not really. Like
because again, it's wanting to see themselves as a hero of the story.
Yeah,
and that's not how it works. You're kind of the villain of the Bible. You're not the hero of the Bible.
Yeah, you're not David. His Chandler would say, "You need to be rescued. You're not the one. You're the afraid Israelite.
Yes, you're the ones who won't fight Goliath.
You're not David. That's so good. So perfect.
So yeah, we'll try to get some more content up this week on the other stuff, on the other books. I'm curious about this because I've never seen that before. I found
this at half price too. It's called Good and Evil. It's all black and white. It's kind of like the Crumb book. I mean, it's not as it skips, but it has Bible verses at the bottom, kind of where they're at.
Okay.
In the in Isaiah and in Genesis and we go through Judges and Deuteronomy. It goes through a lot. I mean, it skips some. Like Joseph's whole story's not even in here.
Wow.
Yeah. So it just
That's
goes from like Abraham to Moses and stuff. It's like, all right, you kind of skip some, but it goes through the New Testament too, Jesus and stuff, but it ends at like Acts, I think.
That's interesting. I'm gonna have to find if I ever can. When I was a kid, I had a book called the Adventure Bible, and I've seen other ones before, and they're not the same.
Really?
No, this one is very different. It was drawn in like a 1980s comic book style. It was like super well illustrated.
Wolfman,
yeah, it really did look like a Marv Wolfman book.
And a mullet. Big girls have big hair.
Oh man, we should redraw that now. Like it's Peter with a mullet at Pentecost. Flowy sleeve, an open collar, hairy chest,
medallion.
Yeah,
it's like 70s.
It really is. Well, with that, we'll sign off for the day. Like I said, follow us on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. We'll have stuff up on there. Hopefully, more content coming soon. But in the meantime, this has been the time and the place. Thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
See you.